There were 31 of them, 31 men from B Squadron, 1st Special Air Service, who had parachuted into occupied France in June 1944, moved through the forests of the Vienne department for weeks on end, cut railway lines, destroyed fuel trains, lived off forested hillsides, and the quiet charity of French farm families who risked death every time they offered bread. They had survived. They had done their job. They had kept moving in the way that every man in the regiment understood was the only way to stay alive behind German lines. Then their camp was betrayed. Then the SS found them. Then the 31 were captured. And then, without trial, without negotiation, without the protection the Geneva Convention demanded, they were executed in groups of 3 in the forests near Gaggenau, shot in the head in a bomb crater in the November dark of 1944. When word reached Lieutenant Colonel Brian Franks, the commanding officer of 2nd SAS, his first reaction was not grief, though grief came later. His first reaction was controlled, focused, precise fury. The fury of a man who had watched his regiment fight for 3 years across North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and now France, who had argued at the highest levels of Allied command about how the SAS should be used, who had seen a brother officer sacked 2 days before D-Day for refusing to back down, and who now had 31 of his men in unmarked graves because the operation had been designed, sanctioned, and supplied by a chain of command that had never fully understood what the regiment was, where it had come from, or what it could and could not survive. That friction, the grinding, persistent, sometimes explosive collision between what the SAS knew about itself and what senior Allied commanders assumed they were dealing with, runs through the entire history of the regiment from the moment it was founded in 1941 to the final weeks of the war in Germany. It is a story about experience, about who had it, who lacked it, and what happened when men who had spent years learning something precise and dangerous were handed over to officers who had not been there, had not watched the same lessons bought with the same blood, and were making assumptions about capability that experience had already proven wrong. The British veterans did not refuse orders because they were arrogant. They refused them, or resisted them, or challenged them at the cost of their careers because they knew things that the men giving the orders did not. And in the specific, merciless calculus of Special Forces warfare, being ordered to do the wrong thing by someone who does not understand what the right thing is will get you killed in a bomb crater in the French forest, executed in groups of 3. This is that story. And to understand why it happened, you have to start where the regiment itself started. You have to go back to 1941, to the beginning, to the fundamental act of institutional defiance that founded the SAS in the first place. The SAS was not created by a smooth chain of command decision working its way through proper channels. It was created by a man who broke into headquarters on crutches. David Sterling was 25 years old, a lieutenant in the Scots Guards, recovering from a broken back sustained in an unauthorized parachute jump outside Mersa Matruh in Egypt. He had spent his hospital weeks designing an idea that his superiors had no interest in hearing. He needed to reach General Auchinleck. He did not have an appointment. He did not have access. He had a set of crutches, a gap in the perimeter wire at Middle East headquarters in Cairo, and enough conviction to leave the crutches against a tree and limp through the building until he found a general willing to listen. The general he found was not Auchinleck. It was the deputy commander, General Neil Ritchie, who had Sterling escorted into his office, partly because the alternative was having a limping lieutenant removed from the building by military police. Ritchie read the plan. He found it coherent enough to pass upward. Within a week, Sterling had been promoted to captain and given authority to form a unit of 66 men. The unit was named L Detachment, Special Air Service Brigade. It was a deception as much as a military formation, designed to suggest to German and Italian intelligence that a full British parachute brigade was operational in Egypt, when nothing of the kind existed. The SAS began its life as a ghost, a paper unit performing a real function for a fake army. and that originating deception set the tone for every relationship the regiment would have with the conventional command structures above it for the next 4 years. The men Sterling recruited and the training he built were the product of a philosophy that the conventional army found deeply uncomfortable. The philosophy was simple in statement and radical in practice. A very small number of men, selected not for parade ground discipline, but for personal initiative, physical resilience, and the capacity for sustained violence in extreme isolation, could achieve at negligible cost what large conventional formations could not achieve at all. Sterling did not want soldiers who followed orders reliably. He wanted soldiers who could think for themselves in conditions where no order was possible, where there was no radio contact, no backup, no rescue. The selection was informal by later standards, but brutal in effect. Men who could not navigate, could not endure, could not operate independently, were gone. The 60 who remained were men who had already demonstrated that the conventional Army's assumption about how soldiers behave under stress did not apply to them. That independence, that cultivated self-reliance, was the regiment's greatest operational weapon. It was also the thing that made the regiment impossible to manage from the outside. From the moment L Detachment began conducting operations, the men who theoretically commanded the unit from Middle East headquarters found that they had authority over the SAS on paper and almost no authority over it in practice. As one account of those early operations noted, as soon as the men departed their base, they were a law unto themselves, and that was precisely the friction that middle-ranking officers found so galling and that senior commanders like Auchinleck found so useful. By the autumn of 1942, the SAS had grown to nearly 400 men. It had destroyed more than 300 Axis aircraft on the ground, more than the Desert Air Force had destroyed in the air over the same period. It had conducted deep penetration raids across hundreds of kilometers of terrain the Italians had officially classified as impassable. It had become the most effective airfield destruction instrument in the Allied arsenal. And it had done all of this while maintaining an internal culture of studied contempt for the ordinary administrative structures of military life. The officers wore what they wanted. The men addressed each other by first names in ways that would have produced a court-martial in any regular regiment. The concept of rank as something that imposed automatic authority, that deference was owed to a man simply because of the pips on his shoulder, was explicitly and deliberately rejected. This was not indiscipline in any conventional sense. The men who worked with the regiment in those years described a unit of extraordinary cohesion, competence, and shared purpose. But the cohesion and purpose were horizontal, binding the men to each other and to the regiment's own internal standards, not vertical, connecting them upward to the chain of command. When the chain of command issued orders that the regiment's own experience and judgment said were wrong, the orders were challenged. When the challenges failed, they were escalated. When escalation failed, they were refused. That was the SAS culture from its foundation, and it was not an accident. David Sterling had built it deliberately because he believed, with the certainty of a man who had studied the problem, that the worst thing that could happen to a small raiding unit was to have its operations planned and controlled by officers who had never conducted a raid. David Sterling himself was captured in Tunisia in January 1943. His vehicle was found by an Africa Corps reconnaissance unit in terrain he had assessed as clear. He was taken prisoner and eventually transferred to Colditz after 4 escape attempts, where he would spend the rest of the war. The regiment he left behind was battle-hardened beyond anything that existed elsewhere in the Allied order of battle. These were men who had operated for more than a year behind German and Italian lines, who had navigated by stars across hundreds of kilometers of open desert, who had placed explosive charges on aircraft engines in the dark with German sentries. 50 meters away, they understood the tactical environment of the North African desert at a level of precision that no officer who had not done what they had done could possibly replicate from a headquarters mapboard. The Americans arrived in North Africa in November 1942. Operation Torch landed Allied forces in Morocco and Algeria, and for the first time the British formations that had been fighting in the desert for more than 2 years found themselves operating alongside a new partner that was, in the language of the soldiers who witnessed it, comprehensively untested. The U.S. Second Corps moved into the line in the center of Tunisia under Major General Lloyd Fredendall. The British Eighth Army, which by this point had fought from Egypt to the Libyan frontier, crossing thousands of kilometers of desert, defeating Rommel at El Alamein, and driving the Afrika Korps westward in a pursuit that covered the length of Libya, looked at the fresh American formations with the particular wariness of experienced men watching inexperienced ones take up position in terrain they do not understand. The assessment proved accurate faster than anyone wanted. On the 19th of February, 1943, Rommel struck the American lines at Kasserine Pass. He added the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions to his force and drove straight through the center of the Allied line. The U.S. Second Corps broke. American troops abandoned enormous stocks of equipment. The pass fell in a single afternoon. The disaster was halted not by American resistance stiffening, but by Rommel choosing to turn back east out of concern that Montgomery's Eighth Army would attack his rear while he was moving west. The British formations that watched this exchange, men of the Eighth Army who had spent the same months fighting the same panzers across Libya and had paid in full for every lesson now being learned by American battalions at Kasserine, processed the failure with a complicated mixture of sympathy, professional judgment, and the unspoken certainty that comes from having survived what the newcomers had just lost to. What followed was a command arrangement that generated friction significant enough to require personal intervention by Eisenhower and Alexander. The U.S. Second Corps passed to the command of General Harold Alexander's 18th Army Group after Kasserine, placing American formations under British operational control. The politics of this arrangement were delicate, and the personalities involved were not always equal to the delicacy. Friction between British and American commanders was real, documented, and persistent throughout the Tunisian campaign. The British commanders and the soldiers below them had a basis for their operational judgments that was rooted in experience. The Americans were constructing their operational judgments from doctrine learned in classrooms and exercises that had not yet been tested at scale against a competent enemy. In dozens of minor matters of everyday military life, as one contemporary account described it, the two armies were mutually incomprehensible. The incomprehension was not merely cultural, though it was that too. It was experiential. The British formations had been in this war, in this desert, against this specific enemy, for over 2 years. The Americans had been in it for 3 months. That differential in experience was the root of everything that followed. It was not that British veterans considered American soldiers cowards or fools. Many American formations would prove themselves in the months and years ahead with extraordinary courage under fire, and the experienced British commanders knew that green troops with good spirit became seasoned troops given time and the right leadership. The problem was time. The problem was that in the specific, technical, lethal business of special operations, of raids, of deep penetration, of operating without resupply or support behind an enemy's lines, experience was not a quality that could be transferred by briefing. It lived in the men who had acquired it through the doing of it, and it died with those men when they were killed, and it was absent in men who had not yet had to buy it. The SAS Brigade of 1944 was a formation of roughly 2,500 men that included 1st SAS and 2nd SAS, 2 French SAS regiments designated 3rd and 4th SAS, and a Belgian squadron forming 5th SAS, along with signals specialists from the GHQ Liaison Regiment. It had returned to Britain from the Mediterranean in early 1944 to prepare for operations in support of the Allied invasion of Normandy. Most of the British element had not seen Britain for years. They had fought across North Africa, through Sicily, and up the Italian peninsula. They were, in the description of Brigadier Roderick MacLeod, the newly appointed brigade commander, who encountered them for the first time that spring, colorful and curiously dressed ruffians. He meant it as admiration. It was also an accurate description of the appearance presented by men who had spent 3 years operating in environments where the conventions of regimental dress had no survival value. The SAS Brigade's integration into the Allied command structure for Overlord was managed by Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, under General Eisenhower. The Airborne Forces component of that structure was commanded by Lieutenant General Frederick Browning, known throughout the British Army as Boy Browning, an officer of considerable reputation, considerable ego, and considerable attachment to the conventional use of airborne troops as mass entry shock infantry dropped close to the front line. Browning commanded 1st Airborne Corps, and the SAS Brigade nominally fell under his authority for the planning of Normandy operations. The collision between Browning's vision for the SAS and the regiment's own understanding of its purpose was fundamental and irreconcilable. It was not a disagreement about tactics. It was a disagreement about what the regiment was. Browning's plan called for the SAS to be used as conventional airborne infantry, dropped close to the Normandy beaches to act as a blocking force, delaying German panzer reinforcements that would move toward the beachhead in the critical hours after the landings. He wanted them deployed essentially as lightly armed parachute infantry in a role that every parachute infantry unit in the Allied order of battle could perform, and that the SAS, with its specific capabilities, its deep penetration training, its knowledge of living and operating behind enemy lines for weeks at a time, could perform no better and arguably worse than a standard parachute battalion. The SAS officers who heard this plan listened with the patience of men who had seen what happened when their specific capability was misapplied. They had watched it happen in Italy. They had watched their men used as conventional infantry in operations that produced casualties disproportionate to any tactical gain. They had watched the regiment's particular expertise, its ability to operate in small teams deep behind enemy lines, to contact resistance networks, to cut communications, to destroy fuel and ammunition, to keep entire German rear area security forces occupied chasing ghosts across hundreds of square kilometers, squandered in frontal assaults that any infantry battalion could have made, and many infantry battalions had made without needing the SAS to do it. William Sterling, commanding officer of 2nd SAS and elder brother of David, was the man who refused. His position was precise, substantiated, and delivered in writing to Schaff. Browning's plan was suicidal. The SAS lacked the material, the artillery support, the anti-tank weapons, and the manpower to serve as a blocking force against German panzer columns. More critically, it was the wrong use of the regiment's capability at a moment when the right use was available. The correct deployment was deep insertion behind German lines, far enough back to reach the communication networks, the railway lines, the fuel convoys, the signal cables that connected the German rear area to the fighting front. That was what the regiment had been built for. That was what it had proven it could do. Placing it in front of panzer divisions with light weapons was not bravery. It was waste. Browning was not accustomed to being contradicted by lieutenant colonels. He was not accustomed to operational plans being returned with written objections. He was accustomed to obedience. He ordered Sterling to withdraw his criticism. Sterling refused. On the 4th of June 1944, 2 days before D-Day, William Sterling was removed from command of 2nd SAS and replaced by Lieutenant Colonel Brian Franks. He had won the argument and lost his career in the same motion. A senior 2nd SAS officer named Captain Tony Greville Bell later described the reaction inside the regiment. The officers were in absolute agreement with Sterling's decision, he said, because of what he called that thick-headed idiot Browning. The senior officers were inclined to resign collectively, but Sterling told them not to. The regiment needed someone in command who could still function within the system that had just sacked its commanding officer for being correct. The bitterest element of this episode is the verification. When the SAS was eventually deployed, as it had argued it should be deployed, inserted deep into occupied France weeks before the landings and operating there for months afterward in the deep rear of the German defensive line, it performed exactly as its officers had said it would. The SAS Brigade's official assessment by 21st Army Group in December 1944 identified the regiment's greatest effects in France as the moral support given to resistance forces, the adverse effect on enemy morale through continuous harassment of communications, and the intelligence gathered from observation posts in the deep interior. These were the effects produced by small teams operating exactly as the regiment had always intended to operate. They were not the effects of blocking forces in front of panzer columns. Sterling had been right. He had paid for being right with his command. The individual operations in France told the story at the ground level in detail that the planning debates could not capture. Operation Bulbasket, conducted by B Squadron of 1st SAS in the forests east of Poitiers, beginning on the 6th of June 1944, is one of the sharpest examples of both the capability and the vulnerability of the regiment in 1944. The operation's objective was to block the Paris to Bordeaux railway line and to delay German reinforcements, particularly the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, from reaching the Normandy beachhead. Captain John Tonkin led the advance party, dropping onto an area of marsh southwest of Châteauroux, with detailed intelligence contacts provided by SOE networks already in the area. Within days of insertion, the SAS team had located a petrol supply train destined for Das Reich, identified its position, and transmitted a target request to England. The same night, RAF bombers destroyed the train in its sidings. The fuel reserves for one of Germany's most capable armored divisions were gone. That was the regiment operating as it had been built to operate. Then their camp was betrayed. The Germans found them. 33 men were captured. They were held, transported, and on orders from an SS officer named Isselhorst, executed in the forests near Gaggenau in November 1944. 31 SAS men and 4 American airmen were shot in the head in groups of 3 in a bomb crater in the dark. Isselhorst was operating under the Commando Order, Hitler's directive from October 1942 that mandated the execution of all captured Allied Special Forces personnel regardless of whether they were in uniform. Every SAS operator who parachuted into occupied France in 1944 knew about this order. They parachuted in anyway. That is what the conventional command structure at Chef was working with. Men who accepted that if they were captured, they would be murdered, and who went regardless. The collision between that institutional knowledge and the plans drawn up by officers who had never operated behind German lines produced its most dramatic single episode in the story of Operation Leuthen. Brian Franks himself commanded this operation, parachuting into the Vosges Mountains in eastern France on the 30th of August, 1944, to join an advance party that had been in position since the 12th of August. The operational area was 40 miles west of Strasbourg, heavily wooded mountain terrain in a region that was about to receive substantial German reinforcements. The operation had been planned to last 2 weeks. It lasted 2 months. Patton's Third Army, moving toward the Vosges, ran out of supplies and stalled. The SAS team, deep in the mountains with German security forces hunting them and their resistance contacts being rounded up, waited for relief that did not arrive. By the start of October, the situation had become irretrievable. Supplies were gone. The area was saturated with German troops. The operation that had been planned as a 2-week raid became a survival exercise that consumed the operational capacity of an entire regiment. Franks ordered his forces to break into small groups and make their own way back to Allied lines 40 miles away. What followed was the attrition that produced the 31 men in the bomb crater. The lesson was not that the SAS had failed operationally. It had gathered intelligence, harassed German communications, and maintained a presence that forced German security forces to divert resources from the main battle. The lesson was that operations designed by planners who did not understand the difference between 2 weeks and 2 months in an area becoming increasingly hostile, who did not account for the possibility that the conventional relief force would stall, who treated the SAS like a short-duration commando team rather than a deep penetration unit that needed to know with certainty that it had a way out, produced dead men in French forests. Franks pursued the perpetrators after the war with the same methodical intensity he had brought to every operation. He formed the 2nd SAS War Crimes Investigation Team before the regiment was disbanded in October 1945. His intelligence officer, Major Eric Barkworth, spent 3 years in post-war Germany tracking the surviving members of the execution squads. Eiselhorst was eventually tried, convicted, and executed. So was Karl Buck, who had organized the actual shootings, though his death sentence was later commuted. The SAS, sacked as a formation in 1945, held itself together informally through the investigation because the men who had led it understood that the justice their dead deserved would not happen unless someone pursued it, and the institutional framework that had sent those men into the Vosges was not going to pursue it. The relationship between the SAS and the broader Allied command structure in the war was never simply adversarial. It was complicated in the way that all relationships between expertise and authority are complicated. The good senior commanders, the ones who understood what they had, used the regiment's knowledge to shape how it was deployed. Paddy Mayne, who commanded 1st SAS through the post-Stirling period and into Northwest Europe, operated within the command structure effectively because he was given sufficient operational latitude to work with his men's strengths rather than against them. The SAS Brigade's final operations in Germany in 1945, Operation Archway under Brian Franks and the parallel advance under Mayne supporting the Guards Armored and 7th and 11th Armored Divisions in armed jeeps, were models of the regiment being used as it should be used, fast, mobile, deep, exploiting the chaos of a retreating enemy, rather than being placed as a light infantry blocking force in front of armored formations with which it had no chance of survival. In the final days of the war, it was a 1st SAS squadron working with the 11th Armored Division that was among the first British units to reach Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, finding between 50,000 and 60,000 inmates in the camp. The SAS patrols assisted the field security police in the immediate aftermath, hunting war criminals through the surrounding forests. It was the kind of operation that the regiment did not need to be ordered to conduct. The men who had spent 4 years being hunted by the machinery that produced Bergen-Belsen understood instinctively what was required when they arrived. They had been operating in that moral space, the space where the formal command structure ran out, and individual judgment and collective commitment to something larger than orders took over, since September 1940, since the first long-range Desert Group patrol crossed the Egyptian Sand Sea. The regiment that returned from the war, the one that would have its formal existence terminated by the War Office in October 1945 on the grounds that its wartime specialization was no longer required, was a force that had proven repeatedly and at great cost that the knowledge carried by experienced men in their bones, in their reflexes, in their understanding of what worked and what got people killed, was not transferable by briefing and not replaceable by seniority. The commanders who had issued the wrong orders, the plans that had gotten men executed in French forests and captured in Tunisian mountains, had not been fools. They had been officers working from the best information available to them at the level of abstraction at which staff planning necessarily operates. They did not know what the men knew who had been doing it since 1941. That gap, the gap between what the veterans understood and what the newcomers assumed, was never bridged in the conventional sense. It could not be. Experience is not a briefing. It is not a document. It is not a planning cycle or a committee recommendation. It is a body of knowledge that lives only in the people who have acquired it, that transmits only imperfectly and only through the doing of the thing itself, and that dies when those people are killed in bomb craters or captured in mountain passes, and nobody is left who was there when the original lessons were bought. The British veterans who refused orders, who challenged plans, who wrote letters to Schaeff and were sacked for writing them, who stood in front of general officers and said quietly and without drama that the plan was wrong, and they knew it was wrong because they had already seen what happened when you tried to do it that way, were not insubordinate in any morally meaningful sense. They were the repository of institutional knowledge that the institution above them did not possess, and they were trying to prevent it from being spent on the wrong mission. 31 men in a bomb crater in France. Brian Franks hunting their killers in post-war Germany with an unofficial team because the formal system had moved on. Paddy Mayne collecting his 4th Distinguished Service Order and being recommended for the Victoria Cross at Oldenburg in April 1945, and watching the recommendation be downgraded for reasons that military historians are still arguing about. Bill Sterling, sacked 2 days before D-Day, vindicated within months, his active military career finished at 43. These are the specific costs of the collision between experience and authority in one regiment, in one war. The SAS was officially disbanded in October 1945. It was revived 2 years later, in 1947, as 21st SAS and eventually reconstituted as 22nd SAS, the regiment that would fight in Malaya, Borneo, Oman, the Falklands, Northern Ireland, the Gulf, Sierra Leone, Afghanistan, and Iraq, carrying the accumulated institutional knowledge of every previous generation into each new conflict. The men who serve in it today carry something of Jock Lewis's bomb and Ralph Bagnall's sun compass and Bill Sterling's letter to Schaeff and Brian Franks's war crimes investigation team. They carry the knowledge that the gap between what experienced men know and what authority assumes is always real, always dangerous, and always worth the price of being right about it, even when being right costs you everything. The Americans who came to North Africa in November 1942, fresh from training establishments and the classroom study of a war they had not yet fought, would prove themselves as the campaign progressed and the individual costs of lessons mounted. By the time they linked up with Patton's Second Corps near Gabes in April 1943, the British 8th Army veterans who shook hands with their American counterparts on the Gabes to Gafsa Road had 2.5 years of desert war in their bodies. The Americans had 6 months. Neither formation was more courageous than the other. Neither was more committed. The difference was purely experiential, the kind of difference that cannot be negotiated away at a command conference or resolved by a memorandum from Schaeff. This is the thing that the title of this story is trying to name. Not arrogance, not nationalism, not the particular British strain of cultural condescension toward American newcomers, though that condescension existed and was sometimes ugly. The statement at the heart of this story is a tactical one, not a social one. We have been here longer than you. We know things you don't know yet. The things we know are not opinions. They are facts about what happens when you deploy light infantry against panzers, and what happens when a 2-week operation becomes a 2-month operation because the relief force runs out of fuel, and what happens when a camp is betrayed in a forest east of Poitiers, and what it costs to be wrong about any of these things. We are not refusing your orders because we disrespect you. We are refusing them because 31 of our men are already dead in a bomb crater in France, and we know how they got there, and we will not let that happen again if we can stop it. They could not always stop it. The command structure had the authority. The veterans had the knowledge. In the specific and lethal space where those two things failed to align, people died in ways that verified after the fact what the experienced men had been saying before the fact. That verification did not bring the dead back. It did not restore Bill Sterling's command or repair what Browning's insistence on conventional airborne doctrine had cost the regiment in the years it would take to train a generation of men equal to those it had spent. It did not give Franks back the 31 men he spent 3 years pursuing justice for. What it did was teach the lesson that the regiment carried forward into every conflict it would subsequently fight. The lesson that the knowledge lives in the men who do the work, and the men who do the work are the irreplaceable instrument, and the instrument's own understanding of what it can and cannot survive is the most important operational intelligence available to any commander who is wise enough to listen to it. The British veterans who refused to take orders from officers who had not been there were not refusing the war. They were insisting that the war be fought on the terms that gave them and the men beside them the best chance of surviving it. That insistence cost some of them their careers. It saved some of their men's lives. In the arithmetic of that particular war, in those particular forests and deserts, that was enough. Just enough. Not always, but enough.